spoken and they want change. Conservative leader Friedrich Merz is set to become the country's next chancellor after a record number of Germans cast their ballots in the highest turnout since reunification. Meanwhile, the Social Democrats and current Chancellor Olaf Scholz take a hammering. They're now the Conservatives' most likely junior partner in coalition. Scholz says he will not be involved in negotiations. And the far-right Alternative for Germany, the AfD, becomes Germany's #2 party, doubling its share of the votes since the last election. I'm Nicole Fröhlich. It's great to have you with us. Germans have voted for change, with the country's conservatives claiming victory in Sunday's national election. With the votes now tallied, it has become clear that the only way to a majority for Friedrich Merz's Christian Democrats will be a coalition with the Social Democrats. The far-right AfD have come in second with a strong showing, but Merz refuses to work with them, as do all other major German parties. Let's break down the numbers for you. Merz's Conservatives, as I just said, came out on top with 28.5%. The far-right Alternative for Germany doubled their share of the vote to 20.8%, making them the second largest party. Germany's incumbent Social Democrats suffered a crushing defeat, dropping over 9 percentage points to 16.4%. The Greens fell 3 percentage points to 11.6%. The Left Party fared better than expected, with 8.7% of the vote. The BSW, which splintered from the Left Party last year, took only 4.97%. That is just short of the 5% threshold needed to enter parliament. The business-friendly FDP also fell below the 5% threshold and crashed out of parliament until a couple of months ago. They were members of the governing coalition. Other smaller parties together took over 4% of the vote. And we can now have a look at how these results translate into seats for each party in Germany's parliament. The CDU will now be the biggest party in the Bundestag, with 208 out of the total number of 630 seats. The Social Democrats, currently still the governing party, will now have 120 seats, and the Green Party 85 seats. The far-right Alternative for Germany, now the second largest party in the parliament, will have 152 seats. Die Linke, the Left Party, will have 64 seats. And the election outcome leaves different coalition options as theoretical possibilities. One is between the Conservatives and the far-right AfD, which would have an ample majority in parliament, but Friedrich Merz has ruled out a coalition with the AfD. Another possible coalition would be with the SPD. This option would have a slimmer majority in parliament, but is the most likely one since Merz ruled out collaborating with the far right. And they could also bring in the Greens to make for a bigger majority, but let's have a look now at how election night unfolded, starting with the Conservatives, who took first place.
We, the CDU and CSU, the Union bloc, have won this 2025 election. Friedrich Merz is the man in the driving seat. As clear winner of this election, he's set to become German Chancellor, though he still faces the tricky task of building a coalition. His centre-right CDU-CSU bloc received the most votes by a clear margin, though at under 30%, it's not the support Merz wanted. Olaf Scholz will stay on as caretaker chancellor, but his days as Germany's leader are numbered. His SPD party achieved its worst result in a national election since the 19th century. Friends, comrades, this is a bitter election result for the Social Democratic Party. It is a defeat. The Alternative for Germany party nearly doubled its support, the strongest showing for a far-right party since the Second World War. In the post-election discussion on public TV, co-leader Alice Weidel had her eyes on the levers of power.
Our hand is outstretched to take part in the government. We will support the CDU-CSU when there are motions that we approve of, if they go in the right direction. The will of the German people is clear. They want change. They want a coalition between the AfD and the Conservatives.
Weidel predicted the Conservative bloc would not be able to form a stable government, and the AfD would in time become Germany's largest party. But Merz said his party had little in common with the AfD. You can reach out to us as much as you like. We will not pursue misguided policies. The Greens saw a small drop in support, punished as all the government parties were. Among smaller parties, the left benefited from a surge in support from younger voters. It was a campaign dominated by fears. Fears about migration and Russia, a faltering economy, and the fear that Donald Trump is changing Germany's relationship with the United States. Friedrich Merz says he has a plan for all of those issues, but first he needs to find out who will join him in government.
And I want to welcome in the studio with me now DW political correspondent Julia Saudelli and Jan Techow. He's a director and political analyst at the Eurasia Group. So great to have you both here. Let's pick this all apart. First of all, your takeaway from last night's results.
Well, the results were pretty much in line with predictions, so the polls were quite reliable this time around. That has not always been the case in the past. I think what was surprising is that it took so long to sort out whether those two small parties would make it in or not, because that was so important for the question as to whether you can form a coalition with 2 or 3 parties, really the decisive question of the night. Other than this, it will be probably a coalition of weaklings. The Conservative result was, the strongest, but wasn't strong. The Social Democrats lost massively. That was a slap in the face, and they will still be in the next coalition, very likely. So the mandate will be weak, and all of that in face of massive international and national challenges. That's going to be a rough ride.
Yeah. Historically, bad results for the Social Democrats. Who's to blame? Is it Olaf Scholz?
I mean, if we look at his popularity among voters, possibly he's one of the most unpopular chancellors in post-war German history, and there are likely going to now be consequences for Scholz. He's unlikely to actually continue to have a relevant role in the party, given these very catastrophic results we've seen coming from the SPD. Some of its leaders saying that it's time for a new generation to take charge with the party. And, it has been a steady decline for the party, and clearly something has to change, starting with the leadership, but also possibly how they approach what their voters want to see.
Mm-hmm. The incumbent, or the man who's coming in now into the post, Friedrich Merz, he has no governing experience whatsoever. This at a time of unprecedented global challenges. Is he the right man for the job at this point in time?
Well, we will find out very soon. Even the coalition talks that will commence maybe in 2 or 3 weeks' time will be a leadership challenge, to him. He will have to deal with a party, an SPD, that luckily is in government again, from their perspective after this massive defeat, and bringing this together, and then forging out of this a coalition agreement that is up to the challenges, the massive economic crisis, the geopolitical problems that Germany has, that will already, test him and perhaps bring him to the limits of what he can do, and how he then fares on the international stage is entirely untested. He's done a couple of smart things in the run-up to this election. He's reached out to many European leaders, so there is already a working relationship with some of them, so that's a good thing. But, once you have to sit down in that European Council building and hammer out a late night kind of compromise, that's when real stamina is required, and we will have to see whether he can do this. He's untested.
Yeah, he's untested. He will have to strike a compromise first here in Germany. Do you see in the current political discourse a will and a pragmatism that would be needed to find a coalition, find common ground sooner rather than later? They want to have a coalition standing by no longer than Easter, I think it is.
I think during the campaign, we haven't really seen that readiness for compromise, especially coming from Friedrich Merz. He was quite aggressive in campaigning against the SPD and the Greens and the other members of mostly actually the Social Democrats and the Greens within the governing coalition. He had a sort of softer spot for the Free Democrats. But indeed, it was a lot of aggressive campaigning against them and basically saying, no, he does not want to compromise. We've seen that also in Parliament now in January when he brought forward a migration motion that non-binding, but which ended up being approved thanks to the votes of the AFD. He came in with this motion saying, I don't want to compromise on this. I'm going to have my way regardless. People are now hoping to see some more readiness for compromise going into these coalition negotiations, because that's what parliamentary democracy is made up of compromise, and without it, it's going to be impossible to find an agreement to form a coalition.
The Social Democrats, they're in an interesting spot right now, aren't they? Because they took a terrible beating yesterday, but they are in a very powerful position now, so to say, because without them, there won't be a coalition. Any way to a majority goes through the SPD. How do you expect them to play that?
I mean, it cuts both ways. On the one hand, they're required, they can ask for a lot. On the other hand, if they overplay their cards, they have nowhere else to go except into opposition, and that's going to discipline them as well. I'm fairly confident that we will get a compromise. I mean, compromise in Germany is possible. The big question is, will it be a compromise, an ambitious one? One with an agenda that really matters and that is up to these massive challenges that I've mentioned before. I think we cannot have a situation where the Conservatives and the Social Democrats neutralize each other with their respective demands, and then they come out with the least common denominator agenda. I think what we need is something where that kind of ritualistic kabuki kind of falls by the wayside and something more ambitious comes out of it. That's the big question that I think will be answered in the next 6 to 8 weeks, and then we'll see, can they seize this historic moment, which is really out there, not just because of the elections, but because of everything else around it that we find on the agenda today.
Yeah. Yesterday, we heard all of the leading candidates, the leading figures of the parties speak at the same table together. The one who struck a more combative tone, I'd say, was the leader of the CDU sister party, the CSU, and they will also be part of any kind of negotiation. What would be their power going into a three-way talk to get a two-party coalition standing?
Well, I think the first main point is that I'm sure the CDU is quite happy to be able to form a coalition without the Greens being involved. We'd heard from the leadership of the CSU that for them it was a no-go to have the Greens in the same government at the federal level with them. So that seems like a possibility that might not have to happen, and that might make it easier for them to accept conditions that the Social Democrats might pose. The CSU is quite strict on migration. They're also the ones sort of pushing for the Conservatives to push forward a even tougher stance on migration. The Social Democrats in government now have already toughened those measures, but whether they are willing to go all the way together with the CDU and especially the CSU, we're going to have to see what kind of compromise they find there.
Mm-hmm. One party that will not have to find compromises because nobody wants to work with them is the far-right AFD. They've been striking a combative tone on Sunday, of course, also putting, again, the topic of migration front and center. The AFD co-leader Alice Weidel spoke to supporters on election night, praising her party's strong gains. She said a coalition without the AFD would be unstable and doomed to fail.
And as we've seen in the exit polls, what we've seen is that we are the only party who have doubled our position over the last election. Double. They wanted to cut our numbers in half, but the opposite is what has occurred. And one thing is for sure, we will always have an open hand to get involved in a coalition in the German government. The will of Germany is something we will implement. We are always prepared to fulfill the will of the people in a German government. It remains to be seen what will happen in the next few weeks. But friends, if what we predicted occurs, that the CDU carries out election fraud on the AFD by copying our program and then entering into a coalition with the left wing, then there'll be new elections faster than you can imagine, and we will overtake the CDU, and that is our aim.
DW political correspondent Matthew Moore joins us now from Berlin. He takes a closer look at the far-right AFD party. Matthew, the AFD flying high, but no option for power because nobody wants to govern with them. Where does that leave the country and the AFD?
Very good question. I'll just before I answer that question, I'll tell you where I am. I'm outside the press conference that will take place in the next few minutes with the party leaders of the far-right Alternative for Germany, and there's a huge interest in this, and that's really because for the first time in Germany's post-war history, the second biggest force in the German parliament will be an anti-immigration, anti-European Union, a party that wants to take Germany out of the euro currency, a party that wants to re-establish relationships with Russia, that is critical of NATO, and for that it poses huge questions for the German political landscape and for Germany as a whole. And also, it's worth just remembering who this party is. This is a party that in several of its state associations are considered right-wing extremists by security services. Some of its senior figures are considered right-wing extremists. One of them can be legally called a fascist. A court has ruled. And this is a party that is under suspicion as a whole by the security services in Germany for being a suspected case of right-wing extremism. And this is a party that members of the Bundestag, until very recently, wanted to initiate proceedings to look at banning the party. So now that party is the second biggest force in the Bundestag, and it will become impossible to ignore.
Impossible to ignore, but for now, Germany's firewall, the cordon sanitaire excluding the AfD from positions of power, remains in place. It did crack somewhat a couple of weeks back when Friedrich Merz relied on their votes to push through a proposal in Parliament. How committed is the man who will most likely be the next Chancellor to this consensus?
That's the big question that everyone is asking. I mean, you speak to people. I spoke to members of the AfD last night at their election campaign evening, and they sensed that something had shifted with that vote, because they know that if he is willing to do it for a non-binding motion in the German Parliament, then he may well be willing to do it when it comes down to things like getting his migration proposals through the German Parliament. And so what we heard last night was Alice Weidel say, my hand is outstretched, and that doesn't necessarily mean for her that it's coalition or nothing. I mean, I think that the AfD will be looking at any manner of way that they can influence the next government. And as we heard, it could well be that government takes a long time to be formed. It could be a quite unstable government, especially if there are disagreements over the centre-right plans to tackle migration. And it could be that the AfD is then the only option for Friedrich Merz, and that's why they're standing there and they're saying we're willing to do that. Now, it's worth saying that last night, while the leader of the party, the Chancellor candidate Alice Weidel, was saying our hand is outstretched to the centre-right, there were other senior figures in the radical right of the party telling journalists that they would not work with the centre-right until they made a clear break with the Angela Merkel era and denounced what he said was multiculturalism in Germany. So there is a split, like a kind of tension within the party, but at the moment they sense that they can reunite it because they have just got their best result ever, and all they have to do is stand on the sidelines and offer to help whoever is in power when it comes to the issues that the AfD care about, and the core issue for them is migration.
But Merz has stressed over and over again that he will, of course, not form a coalition with the AfD. Just to make that clear to our viewers, Matthew, the AfD did come in first in 5 states in former East Germany. What makes them so popular there?
There's a number of reasons for that. One of them is that there's a sense that in the east of the country there's maybe not as much loyalty to political parties because of the history of the former East. there's another issue that is when you look at income, net wealth in Germany. There's a strong correlation between things like how much financial security people have, and in the East, Germans have less financial security than those in the West, and then they're more likely to vote for a party that's offering lots of solutions to the problems that they see around them. The other issue that has played into the AfD's hands in recent years has been the issue of the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In the former East Germany, there's a lot more sympathy for Russia because of the shared the history, the languages. Basically, that meant that people were torn about that, and then the AfD was the only party, or one of the only parties, really a big party, saying we shouldn't be sending weapons, and we should be constantly talking about trying to pursue diplomatic channels. And so for the voters there, that only meant that the AfD was the only party really that they could turn to. And you also have to look at things like we've just seen in the numbers that have come out. The AfD won the most votes, was the strongest party among the unemployed, among low-skilled workers, and it is those are the kind of we know that the difference between the East and the West in Germany, that economic, if you like, that those who are economic less well off, less prosperous, there's a huge number in the East, and so it just comes together to mean that the AfD is very much their stronghold. What they were hoping for last night, Nicole, was to score their first direct constituency win in the West, the former West Germany, and that didn't transpire. Having said that, they have got their best result ever, and with that comes a huge financial gain because they will get more money through that, and with that comes also just more the normalisation of the party, which is incredibly important for the party.
Yeah. All that said, they will hold 152 out of the 630 seats in the new parliament. How do you expect them to wield that influence?
It's going to change the tenor of the debate in the Bundestag hugely. Already the AfD was a very loud fraction in the Bundestag. Constant jeering. Now they're going to have more than double the number of seats than they had last time, and that's just going to have a big impact on the mood and the atmosphere in the German Parliament in the next 4 years. And as I said, with that huge increase in the number of members of Parliament comes a lot more money that the party can spend on professionalising itself, on spending on marketing, and that's an area where the AfD has really been ahead of the other parties, is spending on its targeted campaigning and selling itself on social platforms like TikTok, on YouTube. And so the ability to get all this money that comes with being a big force in the German Parliament will be used to essentially sell themselves as the only answer, the alternative to the problems that Germany faces. And so that is why there is so much pressure on Friedrich Merz, the man who is most likely to be the next Chancellor of Germany, to establish a coalition quickly and to get a handle on the problems that Germans face. Otherwise, the AfD will be sitting on the sidelines saying, we are the answer, and they will be a very attractive force for many people out there if the government in power doesn't get a grip on the problems.
That's DW's Matthew Moore standing by for us here in Berlin. Thanks so much. Julia Saudelli and Jan Techa are still with us here. Julia, the big German parties seem to be at a loss when it comes to finding ways to win those voters back who turned to the far right, whether it be out of disillusionment or out of protest. What are they missing?
Well, I think actually what we've seen is, especially from the conservative CDU, the party actually taking on some of the rhetoric and some of the big topics that have been successful for the AfD and hoping to win back voters that way. For example, with Friedrich Merz from the CDU actually really pushing for migration to be one of the leading topics of the debate in the last few months. We've seen that happen repeatedly, and in a way, he was hoping that would lead some of maybe unconvinced CDU voters who might be considering voting for the AfD to say, okay, the CDU is now saying they want to be tougher on migration, let's vote for them. There are studies that show that this doesn't necessarily work. It's happened in the past in other European countries and other countries in the world where actually when more centrist moderate parties take on some of the rhetoric and the discourse of more extreme parties, people ultimately go vote for the extreme party. And in a way, we have seen that a bit happening this time too. The voters that ended up not voting for the CDU this time, even though they had in the past, the biggest number of them ended up voting for the AfD in this case. So whether this strategy has really worked for the CDU is a big question. I would argue that possibly it hasn't.
Yeah, this shift to the right is not something we're only seeing in Germany, is it? We're seeing it all over Europe, basically, in the US as well. To what extent would you say that this is part of a broader trend that is not specific to Germany per se?
I mean, when you look at the European landscape alone, it's quite clear that Germany so far has been the total outlier. You look at France, you look at the UK, you look at Italy, you look at Poland, you look at a number of smaller countries like Austria or the Netherlands or some Scandinavian countries, and it's quite clear that all of these countries have moved to the right. And in all of them, with the exception of Spain, there's basically no classic center-left party, center-right party, a classic conservative party, Christian Democrats. They've all disappeared and are now splinter groups. Germany is still the big outlier where a classic, center-right party like the CDU-CSU can, score near the 30% mark, unthinkable in other places. So, Germany is kind of late in that development. And in order not to fall into that same trap, as the French conservatives who are basically non-existent, Friedrich Merz made this gamble. He said, we need to gain back some maneuvering space on the key issue that drives the far right, migration. It will initially hurt us, but we need to strategically gain back this kind of, maneuvering space, the ability to act on that issue, because otherwise we just give it, for free to the far right, and we build some sort of taboo around it. And if you can't talk about it anymore, they will win. You give it to them for free. So he's trying to break through. I think it's a longer gamble. I'm not sure it's going to succeed, but it's the desperate attempt of the last center-right party in Europe standing to not fall into the same trap that the others have fallen into. If they can successfully now change migration policy, remove a part of a real problem, this is not just an imaginary far-right problem, there's a genuine problem in Germany and elsewhere as well. If they can now, straighten this out, toughen migration policy without, going into extremes, then they might have a chance to not fall into that trap and escape the fate that other centrist parties on the right, were unable to escape.
Are the Social Democrats going to do them the favor of assisting them in that endeavor?
Yeah, that is the big question. We have already seen with the Social Democrats in government, also on their part, I would say, a move to the right on issues like migration. They have had to toughen their rules on asylum, on expelling asylum seekers who have been refused. This has been a big part also of the last few months of their government, and they managed to push through these measures also in a coalition with the Greens, who are on migration, have or at least used to have quite a different stance. They might be forced to go along with some of the proposals that the CDU wants to bring forward, because that's the only way that a coalition government will work. And the Social Democrats have said they want to be responsible. They want to do something for the good of the country. The question is also what kind of proposals the CDU is going to bring forward and how sort of tough those are going to be. And whether the SPD can actually, explain that to their voters.
It's still early days. A lot remains to be seen. What we do know is that there has been a lot of international reaction to this vote, among many world leaders congratulating Friedrich Merz. U.S. President Donald Trump celebrated the election result in a social media post, saying the conservative victory was a great day for Germany and the U.S. alike. Trump's confidant, tech billionaire Elon Musk, endorsed the far-right Alternative for Germany party ahead of the vote. Last month, Musk gave a virtual address at an AfD rally saying, quote, "Only the AfD can save Germany," something he also posted on his social media platform, X. Well, Friedrich Merz has been critical of Musk's support for the AfD, saying it resembles election interference by Russia.
The interventions from Washington were no less dramatic and impertinent than the interventions we have seen from Moscow. We are under massive pressure from two sides.
That was Friedrich Merz speaking last night. Well, just a few days ago, he said he was shocked by Donald Trump's comments about Ukraine, saying he had picked up the Russian narrative. He's also spoken about achieving more independence from the U.S. We asked DW correspondent Benjamin Alvarez if he thought we were going to see a transformed relationship between Berlin and longtime ally Washington.
It will be a different relationship, but it remains to be seen how exactly this different relationship will look like. There are some recent statements from Friedrich Merz that are quite remarkable, Pablo. During a debate after the first exit polls came out, he sharply criticized the Trump administration. He said that his priority is to achieve independence from the U.S. When we look at defense, he said step by step. And he also mentioned that one of his main priorities will be to strengthen Europe as quickly as possible. And he said that last week's statements from President Trump made clear that at least his administration pretty much no longer cares about the fate of Europe. So pretty strong words there from Friedrich Merz, who said it's not certain what the future will hold like for NATO, even if there's a European alternative that might be needed ahead of the next NATO summit. And the last thing that he mentioned was calling out what he said was intervention by Elon Musk, one of the most important advisors of President Trump. Merz even equated intervention from Washington and from Moscow, so that's quite remarkable, as he slammed Musk's efforts to benefit the far-right alternative for Germany party that you mentioned here, giving a lot of airtime to Alice Weidel on X, and also repeatedly claiming that the only party that can save Germany is the AfD.
That was Benjamin Alvarez speaking to us from Washington there. Let's give you a quick recap of last night's results of Germany's parliamentary election. Friedrich Merz's Conservatives came out on top with 28.5%. The far-right Alternative for Germany doubled their share of the vote to 20.8%, making them the second largest party in parliament. Germany's incumbent Social Democrats suffered a crushing defeat, dropping over 9 percentage points to 16.4%. The Greens fell 3 percentage points to 11.6%. The Left Party fared better than expected with 8.7% of the vote. The BSW, which splintered from the Left Party last year, only took 4.97%, just short of the 5% threshold needed to enter parliament. The business-friendly FDP, who was part of the governing coalition until last year, also fell below the 5% threshold and crashed out of parliament. Other smaller parties together took over 4% of the vote. Following Germany's election on Sunday, which saw a surge in support for the far-right, international leaders swiftly reacted to the results of the polls. As we just mentioned, Donald Trump gave his support on social media, while French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer congratulated Merz and emphasized strengthening European ties. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also commented on the results and stressed the results' significance for Europe. Meanwhile, far-right leaders celebrated the Alternative for Germany for achieving a historic second-place finish. Let's bring in our correspondent, Rosie Burchard. She joins us from Brussels, where EU foreign ministers are meeting. Rosie, how have European leaders so far been reacting to the German election results?
Well, we've seen congratulations pouring in from leaders across the European Union for Mr. Merz. He's received a call from the likes of Emmanuel Macron, the French president. And there's been, I'd say, two really key messages from foreign ministers filing into these talks in Brussels this morning that I'd pick up on. First of all, we've had a message from some, for example, the Irish foreign minister saying, look, a strong Germany is essential for a strong European Union. Remember, Germany is the biggest economy in the EU, but also as the most populous country, it's seen as a big diplomatic heavyweight. And then then there's also this concern about they're looking really for a quick formation of the coalition in Germany. And that's a message we heard from the EU's Foreign Affairs Chief Kaja Kallas. She said that the decisions at EU level need to be taken and that they need to see Germany getting its act together quickly. And here at this meeting, they're talking about everything from the situation in Gaza to the DRC and, of course, above all, the situation in Ukraine. And that's one thing that's really clear this morning at these talks, is that the world will not wait for Germany.
Mm-hmm. That is something that Friedrich Merz has said over and over again. This election does come at a very uncertain time for the EU and the world, for that matter. Far-right parties recently making strong gains, not just in Germany. What does this mean for the EU and political cohesion here?
Well, what we've seen in general, not just in Germany, as alluded to, is a shift toward the right, so a rightward shift in the centre of gravity of European politics. And that tends to have a couple of results. So potentially a more restrictive migration policy. That's been a trend we've seen over the past couple of years. That may push up against some European Union laws. We'll see how that plays out. And then also, we're expecting a push also in terms of deregulation, so trying to cut red tape and reduce European bureaucracy. Now, you will see the likes of climate campaigners sounding the alarm about that, questioning what it means for the future of the EU's Green Deal. And on the other side of the debate, you'll have those who say, look, if the EU wants to compete with the likes of China and the US, then it simply does need to cut its bureaucracy and manage to step up there. Now, when it comes to the rise of the far right, that's something we've seen across this continent. But also, let's not forget what this means is that with the likely outgoing of German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, that also deals a blow to centre-left politics across this bloc. That's something we've also seen in the past couple of years. We've seen the leaders of Portugal, but also Finland, switch from the centre-left to the centre-right. So there will be some soul-searching not only in the Social Democrat camp in Germany, but across the European Union.
Today also marks 3 years of the full-scale war in Ukraine. What will ministers there in Brussels be talking about, especially in light of a very probable changing of the guard here in Berlin?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's been clear is that Donald Trump's presidency and his recent overtures toward Russian President Vladimir Putin have really sent shockwaves across this continent. We've seen over the past few days a race to get leaders together, to huddle together, to try and make big decisions, to try and ramp up European defence spending, but also foresee a massive boost to European support for Ukraine. And there has been a sense that I've heard from some diplomats that, look, they've kind of had the wrong man in the room when it comes to Germany, with the widespread expectation that Olaf Scholz would be on his way out. So they'll be hoping to hear from Friedrich Merz. He's so far seemed to have made it clear that he wants to remain as a staunch backer of Ukraine. But there are some decisions that need to be taken. There's a paper circulating here among different EU countries on options for how to ramp up that kind of support to Ukraine. One of the options on the table is looking at joint debt, joint borrowing to try and finance a massive increase in defence spending. That's something they will be looking for signs from on Berlin on how palatable that might be. It's certainly been controversial in the past in terms of German response to potential EU joint debt.
Yet Merz has shown a much more hawkish stance when it comes to Ukraine, especially when it comes to weapons deliveries. What does Brussels expect from him in the years to come?
Yeah, well, the fact is that Merz comes into power at a time when the European Union is experiencing a real tectonic shift. There's been so much debate here about how exactly to respond, especially to US President Donald Trump. And we've seen over the past couple of weeks EU leaders looking to kind of contradict the Trump administration, particularly on its assertions about President Zelensky of Ukraine's democratic legitimacy, but not to go so far as to criticise him. And some diplomats I've spoken to here at this talks this morning said they were surprised by just how far Friedrich Merz went in terms of his criticism of the Trump administration. I think what they will be looking for Germany is to see a sign on how much they are willing to continue to spend on support from Ukraine. One of the proposals that's on the table of European ministers as they gather in these talks is looking at boosting Ukraine support in terms of gross national income. Germany, as the biggest economy in the European Union, would continue to be the biggest contributor to that. So they'll be looking for signs in terms of spending, but also, of course, in terms of that kind of more hard on-the-ground power. We're talking about weapons for Ukraine, and then let's not forget there's also a big debate going on here in Europe about whether and what form a potential European down the line peacekeeping force could look like in Ukraine. We've seen so far France and the United Kingdom taking the lead on that, saying they might be willing in some case down the line as part of a deal to send their own troops in to back up a future ceasefire. So far, the German perspective under German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has been very much that any discussion on that is premature, that it's going over Ukraine's head, so they'll be waiting for signs from potentially from Friedrich Merz and under a potential new German government of whether there might be a change in position on that too.
That's Rosie Burchard from Brussels. Thank you. Always great speaking to you. And Jan Techow of the Eurasia Group and our very own Julia Saudelli are still here in the studio with me. Jan, where do you, Friedrich Merz, to move on Ukraine?
I mean, his instincts are a lot more robust than those of Olaf Scholz. He's criticized Scholz many, many times for being too reluctant, always be behind the curve on this, delivering too late. And so his instincts are there to be a lot more robust, also, to increase Germany's military role in general. When it comes to how much responsibility should the country take. But there are at least two problems. One is a coalition partner that might not be as forthcoming on these issues, and we've seen that in the past. And then there's a fiscal issue. Germany's last government basically collapsed over an unresolved fiscal issue. Yep. That new government will inherit this, will have to come up with a budget process for the 25 budget, because we don't have one for this year, and at the same time one for the 26 budget. And there's a fiscal cliff on defense spending a bit further down the road. Nobody knows where that money is going to come from to finance all of that additional, international ambition that Germany needs to show, and that also clearly, as we've just heard, the European partners expect. So that's going to be one of the biggest problems. The SPD might be forthcoming a little more than perhaps in the past. Whether that big fiscal problem can be resolved is entirely unknown at this point. Yeah.
Where does the German public stand on Ukraine, Julia?
Well, we've seen, in the first phases of the war, actually quite big support from the German public for financial and military support for Ukraine, delivering weapons, and the promise coming from German politicians that they would support Ukraine for as long as it takes. We've seen that support waning, going down over the years. We've seen the energy crisis that was a consequence also of this conflict in Germany take a toll on people here, inflation going up, and this is something that has also been a big issue, a big topic debated in this election campaign, inflation, rising costs of living, and it is connected also to what happened in Ukraine, and people see how Germany is putting now more money than it used to in its defense and in supporting Ukraine militarily, and this has also played a role in terms of support for parties that are against support, more support for Ukraine, looking at the AFD, but also in part to the left party. Yeah, let's say that now after 3 years, that strong support for so much military spending on Ukraine has dropped.
Yesterday, Merz mused about the possibilities of, I have it written down here, an independent European defense capability to replace NATO. And he stressed the need for a greater independence from the U.S. Is the CDU's historical transatlanticism dead?
No, I don't think it's dead. At least not, coming from, at least not the CDU killed it.
It's a reaction to what's coming out of Washington. It's a reaction
to a changed situation, indeed. Germany is more than other big countries in Europe dependent on U.S. security services. This kind of new turn that the Trump administration has brought to that narrative, basically challenging the entire European security architecture, is hitting Germany, absolutely smack in the face. And the CDU is reacting now by basically saying, well, we need to adjust. We have to work with the Trump administration as it is. But at the same time, it's quite clear we need to ramp up our own capacity. We have to be more independent as Europeans. Not always saying loudly enough that this means that Germany will have to come around the most in Europe. That most of the bill will have to be footed here. And I've just talked about the fiscal situation. Perhaps one thing to add, which I think is important, when we come to, we'll voters in Germany will the population support this? My sense has been over the last 5 to 10 years, actually, going back to the Afghanistan debate, that yes, people are not, jumping out of their pants, because they're so, ambitious internationally. But if you make a good case, if you explain the strategic necessity to them, if there's some leadership coming from the top level explaining the necessities to them, they will come around. The bigger problem is the political elites themselves. The problem lies with the Berlin bubble more than it does with the people out there. And so I think the Berlin bubble now has to do a learning curve on that international commitment side for Germany that it hasn't been willing to do over the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah. Would you agree with that assessment?
I think so, and I think a lot of it also depends, if we look at it now, if we assume that it's going to be a coalition between the Conservatives and the Social Democrats, what happens also in the leadership of the Social Democrats? We've seen that, Scholz and his sort of group within the party were always more skeptical, more prudent when it came to supporting Ukraine, not wanting to deliver long-range missiles. But there are parts of the party more prominently represented, for example, by Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, who were more hawkish on Ukraine, who wanted to do more and were more decisive in wanting to support Ukraine, but also to increase the capabilities of Germany's military. And if this party, this part of the party now gains more relevance, given the big defeat that was taken by Olaf Scholz and sort of his leadership of the SPD, we might see some change there, I would say, and it could make it easier then to work together with the CDU to find, a more common approach in the issue of Ukraine, but also in general of European and German security.
Yeah. Thank you, too, for the time being. We'll have you stick around, but we have to take another look at some other topics making news around the world. You're watching DW's special coverage of the fallout from Germany's parliamentary election. We're waiting for news conference by the parties, beginning with the far-right AfD in about 15 minutes. That is expected to happen. Let's turn to other news for the time being. A dozen leaders from Europe and Canada have traveled to Ukraine's capital to mark the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion. Arriving by train, the group includes European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The delegation also includes leaders from Spain and Baltic nations. In addition to attending anniversary events, the visiting leaders plan to discuss support for Ukraine as U.S. President Donald Trump seeks warmer ties with Moscow. DW correspondent Karolina Chimoy is reporting from Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, and joins us now. What's happening where you are today? How are people there marking this grim anniversary?
Well, of course, Nicole, it's a sad anniversary. We're talking about 3 years of war, and the day before yesterday, Ukraine had one of the most strongest attacks coming from Russia. 267 drones were flying over Ukraine. It was pretty loud during the night. So that's already very telling. 3 years of war, and they all wanted to be over. As you just said, there's a huge European delegation here. President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, is here with at least a dozen commissioners here. Also, Prime Minister Trudeau is here, different defense ministers, and also a foreign minister. They are all gathering to talk and see if they can fill that gap. Because, Nicole, if we recall what we were talking 1 year ago, it was about the fighter jets F-16 from the United States. And the huge debate was from the United States, shall we send those fighter jets or not? And now we don't even really know where the United States is standing. So the European Union is marking this moment and showing we stand together. We are in Ukraine. We are in Kiev on the third anniversary. And they want to try and fill the gap that the United States might leave behind.
There's lots more to talk about. Stay with us for a second. I want to take a look back at how the war has unfolded over the past 3 years.
Russia's invasion began just before 4 in the morning, on land and from the air. Soon afterwards, Russian tanks started rolling over the border into Ukraine. 10 days later, Russian troops had reached the Kyiv suburbs, barely 20 kilometers from President Zelensky's office. In downtown Kyiv, people could hear the artillery fire on the edge of their city. But Russian troops had underestimated Ukrainian resistance and overstretched their logistics. By early April, Ukraine had pushed Russian troops out of the Kyiv region. As they did so, they came across first evidence of Russian atrocities, like here in Bucha. These were the scenes in Kherson when Ukrainian troops retook the city after 8 months of Russian occupation. Beginning in September, Ukraine retook thousands of square kilometers of territory in the south and east of the country. While Ukraine had gone hard and fast during the previous autumn, Russia's army went for slow and steady advance, mainly in the east. After 10 months of so-called meat grinder siege, Russia captured what was left of the city of Bakhmut. More than 60,000 Russian soldiers are estimated to have been killed or wounded taking the city. After months of speculation, months in which Russia was able to build defences and lay minefields, Ukraine launched its long-awaited counteroffensive. The results were meagre. Ukraine was only able to shift the front line by a few hundred square kilometres. This was something no one had expected. Ukrainian troops on Russian soil. With the front lines in the south and the east well defended and heavily mined, Ukraine struck when Moscow was least expecting it. Within a couple of days, Ukraine had taken the town of Sudzha and surrounding villages. In early January 2025, Ukraine stepped up its long-range drone attacks on Russian oil facilities. The aim was to disrupt the fuel supply to the Russian army, as well as reducing the Kremlin's export earnings. As Russia's invasion of Ukraine reaches its third anniversary, Russia controls about 20% of Ukrainian territory. More than 12,000 Ukrainian civilians have been confirmed killed, and a further 30,000 injured. The true figures are believed to be significantly higher. Military casualty figures are kept under wraps on both sides. Conservative estimates put the military death toll at 80,000 on the Ukrainian side and 200,000 on the Russian side, with many more wounded.
Karolina Chimoy is in Kyiv for us. Karolina, Ukraine could now be losing the U.S. support it has so heavily relied on up to this point. Where do you see the war going from here?
That is a big question, Nicole. President Zelensky and his team, they're trying to get to a deal with the United States. We're talking about the air rares, a deal where the United States would be allowed to be in Ukraine, to have some access to this rare earths in Ukraine. And therefore, President Zelensky and his team, they would expect security guarantees. However, that deal is still being negotiated because President Zelensky said yesterday that the United States did not offer the security guarantees that they need, that Ukraine needs. He mentioned that Ukraine would need around 800,000 soldiers on the ground on a peacekeeping mission if it comes to peace in order to guarantee the security of this country. He also said yesterday during a press conference that he would be willing to step down as a president if Ukraine would become a member of NATO. Now, all of these are things that he has been mentioning during different times, but the United States said that after that talk between President Trump and Putin, that Russia would not accept that. So that is the situation we're in now. President Zelensky knows that they have to rely on the European Union, but the big question is if the European Union can really fill that gap. And this is why European leaders are gathered today here in Kiev also to talk about that. But still, the relation with the United States and between the United States and Ukraine will still be one of the most important ones.
Yeah, you mentioned that press conference that took place last night where President Zelensky said he'd give up his post in exchange for peace under the security umbrella of NATO. Let's listen into some of what he had to say. We should have that soundbite here. Let's see if we can play it.
The Ukrainian president took to the stage to answer journalists' questions on the eve of the third anniversary of Russia's invasion. Amid fierce criticism from the Trump administration, Volodymyr Zelensky stayed firm in his push to get security guarantees from Washington and eventually join NATO. When asked if he would resign in exchange for peace, Zelensky said he's prepared to step down if needed.
If to achieve peace you really need me to give up my post, I'm ready. I can trade it for NATO, if there are such conditions. But at this moment, I don't want to talk about it for a long time. I am focused on Ukraine's security today, not in 20 years. I am not going to be in power for decades.
U.S. President Donald Trump has demanded that Ukraine give the U.S. $500 billion in valuable raw materials as a payback for American aid. Zelensky has rejected the demands.
I negotiated with Biden and negotiated with the Congress of the United States of America. I am grateful to the Congress. There was bipartisan support for the grants. A grant is not a debt, and we do not have a debt to repay.
The Ukrainian president added he would not agree to a deal that would have to be paid off by 10 generations of future Ukrainians. Zelensky's comments followed a heated exchange with Donald Trump, who last week called him a, quote, dictator without elections. The Ukrainian leader said he was not offended by Trump's remarks.
I would not describe the words President Trump addressed to me as a compliment, to put it mildly. Yes, but why be offended? One might be offended by the word dictator if he was a dictator. But I take it like this. What can you do? We will live with the U.S. somehow.
Zelensky also called on Trump to meet with him before any summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Carolina there in Kyiv, how were President Zelensky's remarks last night received in Ukraine where you are and abroad?
Can you repeat that question, please, Nicole?
How were those remarks, the fact that Volodymyr Zelensky said that he might be willing to step down in exchange for security guarantees and peace, how were those received in Ukraine and by Ukraine's allies?
Everyone wants peace, Nicole, so nobody really had anything to say against that. But of course, there could be presidential elections, and that's what people probably would like to see once it comes to peace, because right now no one wants elections here. It would be a big challenge to have elections during war, because there are so many soldiers at the front. Also something that President Zelensky mentioned yesterday, how could you secure to have observers in the country if there are so many frontline cities where it's just dangerous to be in? So it would be pretty impossible to have presidential elections during a wartime. But if it comes to peace, once peace is here in Ukraine, of course people would like to have elections. And President Zelensky, why not, might perhaps also be a candidate during those elections. But his words yesterday were just underlying how important it is for him to bring peace back to his country and to guarantee the security that Ukraine needs now and also for the coming generations.
That's DW's Carolina Chimoy in Kyiv. Thanks so much. Let's take a look now at some other stories making news around the world today. Pope Francis has asked Catholics worldwide to pray for him as he battles pneumonia and a complex lung infection, which has left him in a critical condition. Blood tests showed he also suffered from early stages of kidney failure, but doctors said it was under control. The Vatican says the 88-year-old is alert, responsive, and attended Mass on Sunday. Authorities in Turkey say at least 133 people have died from drinking counterfeit alcohol since the start of this year. Dozens more are still hospitalized. Turkey's high taxes on alcohol have fueled illegal production. Police raids across the country uncovered thousands of liters of bootleg alcohol and distillation machines. Spanish police have released video of an operation to free 48 women from a people trafficking ring. Dozens of suspects were arrested in Alicante and Murcia. Authorities say criminals exploited more than 1,000 women in nightclubs. Israeli tanks have started moving into the occupied West Bank for the first time since 2002. Shortly after Israel's defense minister announced his plans for troops to stay there for the coming year, he said. Several tanks rolled into Jenin on Sunday. The offensive has already caused tens of thousands of Palestinians to flee. And let's recap the results of Sunday's parliamentary election here in Germany for you. Friedrich Merz's Conservatives came out on top with 28.5%. The far-right Alternative for Germany doubled their share of the vote to 20.8%, making them the second largest party. Germany's incumbent Social Democrats suffered a crushing defeat, dropping over 9 percentage points to 16.4%. The Greens fell 3 percentage points to 11.6%. The Left Party fared much better than expected, with 8.7% of the vote. The BSW, which splintered from the Left Party last year, only took 4.97%, just short of the 5% threshold needed to enter Parliament. And the business-friendly FDP, which up until a couple of months ago, was part of the governing coalition, also fell below the 5% threshold and crashed out of Parliament. Other smaller parties together took over 4% of the vote. And we can now look at how that translates into seats for each party in Germany's parliament. The CDU will now be the biggest party in the Bundestag with 208 out of the total number of 630 seats. The Social Democrats, currently still the governing party, will now have 120 seats, and the Green Party 85 seats. The far-right Alternative for Germany, now the second largest party in the parliament, will have 152 seats. Die Linke, that's the far left, will have 64 seats. And the election outcome leaves different coalition options as theoretical possibilities. One is between the Conservatives and the far-right AfD, a very theoretical one, because even though they would have an ample majority in Parliament, Friedrich Merz has ruled out a coalition with the AfD. Another possible coalition would be with the Social Democrats. This option would have a slimmer majority in Parliament, but is the most likely one, since Merz has, as I just said, ruled out collaborating with the far right. We're expecting to go to a press conference by the far-right AfD shortly, but first, Conservative leader Friedrich Merz said he'll get down to work on forming a governing coalition as soon as possible. Here's more on the man poised to become Germany's next chancellor.
This is the man of the moment. Friedrich Merz just led the conservative CDU-CSU to their first election victory since the Merkel years.
The world won't wait for us. It won't wait for long, drawn-out coalition negotiations. We must be capable of acting again quickly so that we can do the right thing in Germany, so that we're present again in Europe, and so that the world sees Germany has a reliable government again.
His pledge? A U-turn on migration and the economy. His style? Decisive, say his followers. Uncompromising, even abrasive, say his critics. Trump-like at times.
If I'm elected to be the Chancellor of Germany, on my first day in office, I will instruct the Federal Ministry of the Interior, using the Chancellor's authority to issue directives, to permanently control all Germany's national borders with its neighbours.
That reaction to a deadly stabbing by an Afghan asylum seeker saw him take a political risk. He crossed his own red line by allowing the far-right AfD, for the first time in German post-war history, to become the deciding factor in securing a majority in parliament. Tens of thousands took to the street in protest. Even Angela Merkel condemned his decision to accept AfD votes rather than seek compromise with other parties of the centre.
From my point of view, even under difficult conditions, it should not come to the point where majorities are achieved with the help of the AfD.
While Merz's political manoeuvre remained unpopular.
And speaking of the AfD, we need to interrupt that report right there because we can now take you live to a press conference by the two heads of the far-right party taking place here in Berlin. Those are live pictures you're seeing there right now. That is Alice Weidel and Tino Kruppalla, the two heads of the AfD at the federal level. And let's listen into what they have to say after they secured the best showing of their party and party history and made sure the far right became, for the first time in post-war history, the second strongest party in parliament. What do you expect them to say?
So, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, ich würde gerne anfangen.
Colleagues, I'd like to begin.
Darf ich Sie noch mal bitten, Platz zu nehmen?
If I could ask you to take your seats, please, we would like to begin.
Liebe Kolleginnen, liebe Kollegen, herzlich willkommen in der
Colleagues, a warm welcome to the Federal Press Conference for our traditional press conference marathon. After the elections, we will begin with the AfD. We have the two heads of the party, Dr. Alice Weidel and Timo Kruppala. Now, as we have a number of foreign journalists present, I just wanted to say that this conference is not held by the government. It is an independent association of journalists, and our aim is to hold press conferences so that our colleagues can report on events. Dr. Weidel, you have the floor. Thank you very much, and a warm welcome to the Federal Press Conference of the AfD. A very good morning. I'm pleased that so many of you have come out in your numbers. We have the results now of the elections, and the AfD has been able to achieve a historic success. We have the best result we've ever had in the history of our party, and are very pleased about this. We've been able to increase, indeed double our results since the last elections 3 years ago, and that is an amazing success in view of the fact that our party is only 12 years old. No one in Europe has ever achieved such a result in such a short period of time, to establish ourselves as a big tent party. We are the second biggest party in Germany and rising. And let me tell you one thing. Even after the last elections, the European elections, that was last year, we were able to increase our result by 5% within 7 months. So this is a very, very strong result. We are very strong among young voters, which is a clear indicator that we are the party of the future. Young people want to have a perspective for their lives, and we, as the alternative for Germany, can offer them these perspectives. And as I said yesterday, and in the last few weeks have emphasized, we are prepared to take on responsibility, because German voters have voted for political change. We have a strong majority for the AfD and the CDU, and voters want a centrist right-wing party. Friedrich Merz seems to be sticking to his attitude of blocking working together with the AfD, which we do not think is democratic. You cannot simply exclude millions of voters. And so it is down to the Union bloc to see how they deal with this. But what we can expect is that if they do have a coalition with the SPD, they will not be able to implement all of the AfD positions that they copied. However, we take a pragmatic view. Tomorrow we will constitute our parliamentary group. We have nearly twice as many MPs as we had. We have 152 seats, which is nearly twice as many as we had in the last term in office. So we're looking forward to that. We will be electing our executive committee tomorrow. We'd like to welcome all of our new colleagues. And I would also like to thank all of our voters, all of our supporters, and particularly all of those who helped us tirelessly during the election campaign, members of our party. We're very proud of our election campaign. It went extremely well. And as a result, we have achieved a historical result. We're very happy. I'm very happy about the results. We have established a very good platform here, a strategic platform, which has the best possible prerequisites to overtake the CDU in the next elections. I expect us to become the strongest party in the next elections and to have the mandate to form the government. Mr. Kupella. A very good morning for me as well, and I would like to thank over 10 million voters who cast their vote for us, doubling the number of voters from the last election. Of course, I would like to thank our members and our campaign helpers for joining ranks, a very disciplined election campaign. I would also like to congratulate the CDU on winning the elections. I think that's only good form. Ms. Weidel has referred to a number of points. I'll just add one or two things regarding some of the issues that played a role in this election campaign. Migration was at the top of the list, but peace as well, particularly in Eastern Germany, and the economic situation. Eastern Germany, of 84 constituencies, we were able to win 44 constituencies directly, and the voters showed with 40% what they think of this firewall approach. And I think that this is a consequence that the CDU has to think about. I'd like to remind you of 2017, when the AfD in Saxony had 0.1% ahead of the CDU. And at that point, Mr. Tillich, the Saxony state premier, withdrew, stepped down, and I hope there'll be similar results. You will see that you have formed governments that go against what the people want. But all in all, I would like to thank our Chancellor candidate. Alice Weidel was sensational in the election campaign. I'm very proud of her. I'm proud of being leader of the co-leader of the party, and I was proud to be able to support her to get this result. What's really sensational, and naturally, we will now humbly get down to work, and of course, we want to do justice to our mandate as the strongest opposition party, because this is important, so that in the next election, and if we continue to be excluded by the others, and this is perhaps a warning, if we are not allowed to head committees, not allowed to be the vice president, we have nearly over 150 seats. I think the voters have shown what democracy is. The AfD has a major contribution to democracy. If you think about how many non-voters we managed to mobilize, namely 2 million people who have gone to vote just for us, we have an amazing voter turnout, over 80%, 84% voter turnout, also thanks to the AfD. So I want to thank the voters who came out to support us, and thank you for your attention. We can begin with the question. Thank you for these statements. We have a bit of time now. I doubt I'll manage to take all the questions, but I'll do my best. And there are some press representatives who are here as guests. I would just like to say that they do not have the right to ask questions. Coming now to Ms. Lindner's question first. Good morning, Ms. Weidel. I'd like to know what your take is on a reform of the debt brake.
Good morning, Ms. Lindner. Thank you for your question. Essentially, I would say that a state should not spend more than it has. It really shouldn't make any debts at all. That would be, by definition, its role, or at least that's my personal opinion. And since the state has been going further and further into debt over decades, it shows that it cannot manage taxpayers' money well. This is why we have said that in view of record tax revenue last year, we have to spend less and we have to cut through with a strong hand to ensure that there's spending to ensure that there's more money for taxpayers. The state must have focus on domestic and external security and the guarantee of ensuring a decent public infrastructure is available to its citizens, a decent education system. Now, you know all of this. All of this has been neglected. The predecessor government has ensured that we are dealing with a status of deindustrialization for the last 8 years because of the highest energy prices. The taxpayers are being fleeced. We have open borders. We have completely lost control. There is a case that lawlessness is prevalent. Mr. Merz will not be able to assert his plans with a coalition. A grand coalition with the SPD will mean that he will not be able to deliver on any of his election promises. And since he does not wish to be prepared to assert the debt brake, that is the opposite of what this country needs.
Meine Frage ist bevor in Ihrer Antwort nicht, wie stehen Sie denn dazu? Würden Sie das unterstützen für die Bundeswehr?
What about the German armed forces? What would you say about that? Well, we talk about a special military fund, but it's actually not a special fund. It is special debts. I've told you my position on debts. The state should spend its money like a company would. And as soon as a company is in debt, you know what happens. And the same should be true for states, I believe. And this state has to be managed seriously and properly and needs to spend taxpayers' money sensibly. Mrs. Sternberg.
Head there, that was Alice Weidel, head of the Alternative for Germany. We can see her very pleased there, saying she's prepared to take on responsibility and that her party would make sure that the CDU would not be able to implement the AfD positions she says they copied. And for more, we can cross over to our correspondent, Bernd Riegert, who has been following all of this from our studio here in Berlin. Bernd, what are your takeaways from what we just heard?
Well, as you could expect, the party leadership of the AfD, the far right, took some victory laps here in the building just a couple of meters away where I'm sitting. The interest in this press conference was very big. There were lots of camera teams, and Alice Weidel enjoyed this, of course. And if you look at the numbers, it's clear that she is right when she said they have a win, a historic win. Actually, they doubled their figures, and Mrs. Weidel was very proud of that and also offered again a coalition with the Conservatives, with the CDU, CSU, which the Conservatives, of course, reject. But she said the people's will is a majority of Conservatives and far right, and she predicted that in 2029, so the next election, the party will even be bigger than the Conservatives and then take over. So she made some very far-reaching promises here. And when it comes to concrete policies, the AfD is asking for more leverage and more participation in the parliament. For example, they want, of course, now be part of the presidency of the parliament. So far, they didn't get a vice president and also no committee heads. And that might change because there are now 152 deputies in the Bundestag that incorporates 630 seats.
Yeah, how do you expect them to wield that newfound power?
Well, the sheer size of this group is, of course, important. Is it really possible to keep a party out of the making and working of the Bundestag if the party is the second biggest bloc already in the parliament? Last time, the AfD came in as the fourth. Now they are the second one after the Conservative, and it's hard to imagine that this can be ignored, but we are not sure how the other parties will react. The Conservatives so far, and also the Social Democrats and the Greens, said there will be no cooperation with the AfD, but we have to see if that holds during the next 4 years. And the AfD might also be needed if it comes to changes in the constitution in Germany, if that's necessary, for example, to reform the debt brake and other things. So the leverage is, of course, bigger now, and they can say 10 million people in Germany voted for the AfD.
Yeah, and they always insist in the fact that that cordon sanitaire, that firewall, as it's called here in Germany, is anti-democratic. Is there a sense among voters that that is the case?
Well, many voters in Germany said that it does not make any sense anymore because they want, for example, change in migration policies, tougher stances, tougher measures in migration. And many voters say if a coalition between Conservatives and AfD is feasible, then let's do it. If you look at the numbers from the poll institutions, from the they were done before the election, there are a couple of, not a majority, but many voters that say this firewall is not working anymore. A cooperation might be useful in some cases. And especially if you look at the eastern part of Germany, there the AfD has in relatively a majority in all precincts. So the people are actually supporting the stance of the AfD, and it might be that the firewall at least will crack over the next 4 years.
What makes the AfD so attractive to voters, especially in Germany's former East?
Well, the AfD is playing well in the East because it's supporting many issues that are of concern for voters in the East. Social issues, also the war of Russia against Ukraine. Many voters there say it's enough, we have to find a peace deal. Also the social demands in the East and this feeling that the East is somehow neglected. Also security concerns were important for the voters after the incidences where asylum seekers and other foreigners were the suspects for atrocities and knife attacks and also terror attacks on the Christmas market in Magdeburg, for example, a city in eastern Germany. This all played into the hands of the AfD. And you also have to say that the AfD somehow resonates with this feeling very well, and the AfD also took 2 direct mandates in the East, so that's a sign that they are very well doing there. And they also managed to motivate many people to vote for them for the first time. The turnout was very high, 84%. And many of these voters that were not going to the polls last time are now going to the polls to vote for the AfD. So mobilization is also very strong.
Yeah, the AfD is going to be the biggest opposition power in Parliament. That much is for sure. We just heard the co-chair of the AfD praise the work Alice Weidel did on the campaign trail. What role do you expect her to play now going forward?
Well, Alice Weidel hardened her position over the last years and weeks. She is moving more to the right even, and she has a very harsh rhetoric, and you can expect her as the opposition leader that she will fiercely criticize, of course, the next Chancellor. That might be Friedrich Merz, the leader of the Conservatives. So she will play a very tough role on that and try to gain more support by disappointed voters in the East and in the West also. So you can expect very fiercely debates in the Bundestag. She will not make any easy, well, not an easy way for the Grand Coalition to govern the coalition that might form out of SPD, the Social Democrats and the Conservatives.
That was our political correspondent, Bernd Riegert. Thank you so much. And Ben's colleague, our correspondent Julia Saudelli, is still with us, as well as Jan Techau. He's a political analyst and director at the Eurasia Group. So great that you're still with me because there's a lot to unpack here. Let's look at that press conference. Was there anything we heard there that we hadn't heard before, Julia?
I wouldn't say so. Obviously, you know, now the AfD has a chance to really rejoice and, you know, they have achieved the result that they were hoping for. Possibly they might have been hoping for a couple percentage points more, but it's still a historic result and, you know, they are doing their victory lap now. And I must say we heard from Alice Weidel, she said that she sees this as sees the AfD as the only party in Europe that has achieved such success in such a short amount of time. I would like to fact check a little. I can think of the Brothers of Italy. In Italy, Giorgia Meloni's party, they, after only 10 years from their founding, came in with 25% and are leading the government in Italy now. So I don't know if this comparison is fair from Alice Weidel, but definitely a big success for the AfD. And they are now obviously criticizing the Conservatives for not going into a coalition with them. They say this is anti-democratic, that this is not the will of the voters. That's also debatable because in a parliamentary democracy, it's not necessarily, you know, it's not a first past the post system, or it's not a system that necessarily means that the first two parties have to govern together. But obviously these are things that we've heard before from the AfD, and it's obviously a message that is successful for them also with their voters who are frustrated that the party isn't coming into government.
Yeah. The far right doing a victory lap in Germany, of all places. What signal does that send to Germany's allies abroad?
Now, the Germans, of course, want to hear the answer to the question that everybody is like gravely concerned in Europe. You know, but as we've said earlier in this broadcast, it's basically a normalization. Most of the other European countries have undergone similar processes, and so, you know, my expectation is that you know, there will be a little bit of historically based noise, but most people will take this in, you know, with a lot of pragmatism. What I find so astonishing is that, you know, we've basically also here have exclusively discussed the AfD, but the AfD is only part of the story of what happened tonight. You know, they will not be in power. The burden on sorting the economic mess and the geopolitical mess out will be on other people. The AfD will essentially be a bystander. So, you know, the story of tonight is that we have a government that has a fresh mandate, but a weak mandate, but goes into a situation where they actually need a strong mandate. And I think that is something that we should discuss a little more. We're basically a little bit actually falling into that same trap that we've been falling in for the last 10 years, which is to give these people coverage when basically they're not saying anything new. They're telling us the same story again and again about legitimacy, about how they're the real voice of the people, but have essentially nothing to offer. So I think, you know, we need to really start talking about the issues that matter and talk about the stuff that you know, will happen very, very soon in this country that will be quite uncomfortable. But of course,
what is the biggest challenge at hand? Because there are plenty.
Twofold. First of all, the economic crisis, which has really only just started. We haven't had growth in this country for 5 years, and we've had a recession for the last 2, and this will likely be another recession year. That's going to eat our funds. That's going to eat our budgets away at a time where we need massively more funds. And the second is, we just have a revolution in the European security setup. You know, our alliances are falling by the wayside. You know, the security architecture is challenged, not just by the Russians, but now by a US president who adopts the Russian position, and by the Chinese, who are just waiting on the sidelines to crush the markets over here because they have their own intentions. You know, so we have a perfect storm situation where you have, you know, a domestic weakness and geopolitical pressure from the outside, and that needs to be channeled somehow.
Let's look at the domestic challenges first, especially the economy, where the positions of SPD, the likely coalition partner going forward with the Christian Democrats, could not be more diametrically opposed in some senses to the position the CDU holds. They want to hold on to the debt brake. It sounds like a very boring topic, but it is fascinating once you dive into it. They see it as a promise to the future generation, and the SPD, on the other hand, sees it as a burden on the future generation, a break to innovation, to moving forward, to development of the country. Is there a universe in which you see them landing on one page on this?
We have seen some movement on this front coming from the Conservatives. We have heard Friedrich Merz say that he might be willing to compromise on the debt brake and to allow some exceptions or to reform Germany's so-called debt brake, so basically limiting how much debt the state can incur to finance investment and other spending. And he has said that there might be a possibility to reform that. And you know, it also might be in the CDU's interest to move on this because Germany is going to need investment to try to restart its economy. It's going to basically need to transform its economy in a way that is more innovative, more competitive, more going in a more green direction, because that is the future, and we're seeing that all over the world. And so for Germany to stay at the top of its game and at the top of some of the biggest economies in the world, it's going to have to invest big time in reforming their economy. And at the same time, we hear from the CDU that they also don't want to put the burden on the taxpayers. They do not want to increase taxes. They would like to reduce them. So where is this financing going to have to come from? So it might actually, you know, be in Friedrich Merz's interest to go ahead and reform this debt brake. Also, when we look at what Germans think, it's more or less half and half divided, with a bit of a stronger support for a reform in terms of what they should do with the debt brake. So it's not like the entire country is against this, and this would allow a lot more room to maneuver in terms of reforming the country's economy, but also looking at the security situation and increasing defense spending, looking at the geopolitical situation, which is going to be critical in the coming years.
Yeah. Do you see Friedrich Merz getting the German economy, Europe's biggest economy, back on track in 4 years?
I think what we have here is, you know, a Merz who's quite ambitious on classic conservative economics, you know, supply-side economics, reducing regulation, trimming the welfare state, lowering taxes, the classic supply-side program. And then you have a coalition partner, the Social Democrats, who want the exact opposite. More debt, deficit spending, state-sponsored investment programs. And I think the risk that we're running now is that they're going to neutralize each other, and that we will get, you know, a very mediocre, you know, reform agenda, when what in reality they should be doing is both, you know, a lot of both. You know, we need massive structural reform, conservative style, and we need massive investments, as we just heard, you know, more social democratic style. If we can't find an agenda that does both at an ambitious level, we'll be in trouble.
Can we find that agenda with the options on the table right now?
Only if the two parties that will go into this coalition realize the historic moment. Historic for two reasons. If they don't get this stuff done over the next 4 years, the AfD will be the strongest party 4 years down the road. That's the first historic element. And the second historic element is that external pressure, that real game changer where this country is about to lose its peace. And it needs to do a lot more to guarantee that peace itself, you know, and in conjunction with the other European powers. If the two parties that are going into this coalition cannot, you know, seize that historic moment, forget some of the party political kabuki, you know, and break out of this and come up with an agenda that's bigger than the sum of its parts, then I think we will have a huge problem at our hands. That's the decisive question.
Yeah, the AfD has its sights set on the 2029 election. I'm assuming parties are scrambling to avoid that from becoming a fact, from avoiding, or they want to avoid, of course, the AfD becoming the strongest power. Do they have a plan on how to do that?
I think they have been so focused on, you know, their election campaigns and trying to get the best result possible that is not necessarily in their sight. And, you know, as we've also already discussed, some of the strategies that might have been used, for example, by Friedrich Merz to sort of try and contrast the AfD and win back votes from them, was to sort of go along with the AfD's agenda and their topics and their issues. And it doesn't seem to have necessarily worked out that well. So the parties are going to have to really think well and hard what they're going to do over the next 4 years. And, some people actually say, well, maybe it actually would be a good idea to let the AFD govern and, show what they can do in government and possibly, they don't have government experience, so maybe it won't go that well, and that might actually, bring the support for the AFD down. But there you run the risk of, basically legitimizing the far-right party like the AFD. Also within the German scenario, we've seen that happening across Europe. It hasn't happened here now. So both strategies come with their risks, and it's a tough decision for the other parties to decide how to handle this. But definitely, if the future government manages to address the big problems that Germany is facing, that would certainly help them to bring forward an example as to why people should not vote for the AFD.
I see you moving in your chair. It looks like you have an opinion about this.
No, I agree with a lot of what was said. There's one thing that I disagree with, and that is to basically tell folks again and again that the migration agenda is an AFD topic. It is not. The AFD is just running with it because nobody else will. This is a genuine concern that people have. When you look at the polls, people say it's the #1 issue that they're concerned about next to the economy. This is something that, the center left and the center right have for a long, long time been unwilling to address. Yeah. That's what has given AFD so much fuel in the tank. If we continue to say talking about migration is mimicking the AFD speaking points, we're not going to solve the problem. We will make the AFD bigger.
But if we talk about it the way the AFD does, which in part we've seen the CDU do, and a lot of the rhetoric has moved towards the right, also from the center and the center left, is that the right way to go about it? Or does there need to be an individual strategy from the center to tackle this problem, not only people coming, but also tackling the root causes, helping, the cities, the towns that take these people in, because there's structural problems here in Germany that are not necessarily related to the fact that people are coming and to the people who are coming, but to the infrastructure in place.
The way you talk about it is absolutely crucial. And what's really important in this debate is that you don't talk about migration in a way that's degrading the people that are affected by this. But that doesn't mean you can't talk strict language about the measures that need to be taken, because the numbers have to go down. This issue is eating our democracy from within, and it has been doing so for the last 10 years, since 2015. And we keep on pushing this to the side and saying whoever talks about it in stricter terms, is only making the AFD stronger. The exact opposite is true. If you don't talk about it in more strict terms, in the center of the political spectrum, that's what's going to give the free ride to the AFD. So it's an experiment. Merz has tried to embark on this. He talks a lot stricter about this. For a lot of people on the left, that's already, a thing that you don't do. What is essential is that Merz doesn't start talking about this in degrading ways, because that's the AFD tone. If he can pull this off, if he can talk about this stricter without getting into the nasty bit that's smelling funny, I think he might have a recipe. We'll see whether that works out. The proof will again be in the pudding and in the agenda that this government can come up with. If they can bring the numbers down significantly more than the last government, then they might have a way to success. But it's a small gamble, it's a big gamble, and there's a small margin of error.
Yeah, Merz has kind of dabbled in a rhetoric that I would qualify as degrading towards migrants, saying that they come here to get dentist appointments, and that is why Germans can't get doctor's appointments anymore. But let's not get into that now. I want to know from you, Julia, because you're, of course, an avid observer of what is being said in settings like the one we just saw there with the AFD. Why are the parties in Germany, now AFD aside, so reluctant to tackle the issue of migration head first?
It's a conundrum in a way. It would entail also sort of walking back on a lot of the policy that Germany has seen since 2015, 2016, when a lot of people fleeing conflict in Syria came to Germany, and when the Chancellor at the time, Angela Merkel, said, "We can do this. We can take people in. We can support them here in our country and integrate them." And the perception in parts of the country is that that strategy has failed. We see that, as you said, local authorities who handle a lot of the management of accommodation and giving people assistance and providing integration courses and language courses, they're struggling. They don't have the means to care for these people appropriately. And, often we see in communities that there is this feeling that poorer Germans feel that people who are here seeking asylum or migrants have more state support than they get. And this is obviously something that then influences how they vote and how they perceive the positions of the various parties in parliament. And, we have seen the government of Olaf Scholz toughening measures on migration. If one were to look at it a few years back in a quite tough way that a few years ago might have been unthinkable, also looking at, for example, the Green Party, there has been a lot of conflict within the Green Party as to, how right and how tough these measures on migration have been moving. And there's also the point to be made that some of the even tougher measures that Friedrich Merz is proposing reach the limits of what is allowed in terms of European law, in terms of asylum regulation, that, these are international conventions that Germany is
doesn't
a part
operate
of.
in a vacuum.
So we're going to also have to see now, once the CDU is in government, whether these plans were sort of just campaigning on the part of Merz to show that, he wants to be tougher on migration, or whether he can actually carry through with these proposals, which, many legal scholars and observers have said, we don't know whether this is legally possible.
Yeah. Well, migration, one of the biggest topics for the AFD for sure. Let's take a look now at some key trends behind the far-right AFD's strong showing on Sunday. They were, for the first time, the big winners of the night, managing to double their results since the previous election, as well as solidifying their voter base. The AFD managed to mobilize support from 1.8 million people who didn't vote in the last election. Over 1 million Germans who previously voted for the CDU-CSU, the Conservatives, cast their ballots for the AFD in this election. The AFD also absorbed 890,000 votes from the business-friendly FDP party and 720,000 from the ruling Social Democrats. And the next graphic gives us a sense of where the AFD is strongest. If we can bring that in. I believe we do have a heat map somewhere. There we see it coming up, and that is plainly in Germany's eastern regions. The darker the blue, the greater percentage of voters who opted for the far right, and those dark blue areas correspond pretty exactly with the state boundaries of the former communist East Germany. Julia, why are we seeing this divide between West and East?
For historical reasons, since German reunification, former Eastern Germany has struggled economically. Its whole industry and economic system basically collapsed and had to be set up anew. And this has caused, a lot of disruption for people living in these regions, having to switch careers, find a new life path for themselves. And this insecurity, this sense of disruption, they don't feel has really been addressed and paid attention to from the federal government. This is something that has been ongoing for over 30 years now, and there is still this feeling that they are considered second-class citizens. There is this feeling that the state isn't really taking care of trying to push forward economic development in these areas of Germany. We see many towns in the eastern parts of Germany losing big parts of the population just because there are not that many economic opportunities. And I think this really plays a big part in this feeling of being forgotten by Germany's traditional parties who are not really looking at what's happening in eastern Germany. And this push to want to try out something new, a party that they feel represents them more, a party that feels that, they feel cares more about their issues. We've also seen bigger numbers of unemployed or of, working class people voting for the AFD. And, it goes and touches this sort of, deep-rooted sense of insecurity and sort of feeling left behind. I think that also plays a role in their support there.
Yeah. Jan, the Democratic parties, let's call them that, in Germany, they want to avoid the AFD from becoming the strongest party in 2029. Do we have any international examples to go by where that has actually worked?
I think we've seen a case in Poland quite recently where a populist right-wing nationalist government was voted out of office.
But they came into government first.
They came into government first and then basically, redesigned Polish society in a way that lots of Poles in the end were also not really happy with anymore. But that is a case where, a country that has a very, very conservative voter base, decided against populist government. But after 8 years in a government, that's true. We've seen a couple of countries in Scandinavia where we've seen populist surges, by really quite nasty right-wing parties, where the mainstream parties, especially the Social Democrats, interestingly, in Scandinavia, they are traditionally quite strong, adopted many, many items from the agenda that the hard right and the nationalists brought to the table, especially on migration, quite successfully. When you look at the Social Democrats in Scandinavia, they're unrecognizable for Social Democrats in Germany. Germany, especially West Germany, is very much the outlier in Europe. And of course, that's good, and we want to preserve this. But at the same time, we also have to see how these trends are playing out. On this Eastern kind of issue that we have within Germany, there's an interesting thing that, 5-6 years ago, the Interior Ministry here in Germany, they looked at 110 or so socioeconomic indicators and published an atlas maps based on these data. And that was everything from educational levels to home ownership to, everything that you can imagine. On every single map of these 110 items, the eastern parts of Germany, the former GDR, was markedly different than the West. That is identity building. And if you have this profound sense of we are different, you start to build your own party system, and that's happening. Eastern Germany now essentially has its own party system. Almost none of the Western parties play a role in the East. When you look at yesterday's numbers, it's quite shocking in many ways. But it is rooted in strong socioeconomic data and in strong senses of identity.
Another very interesting demographic factor is age. I believe we do have a map to show you how the different parties fared with younger voters. 1/4 of all voters under the age of 25 chose the left party. The AfD was as popular among young voters, with 21% choosing the far right. The more centrist parties, the CDU, CSU, the SPD, and the Greens, had more trouble reaching young voters, with none of them reaching 15%. So young voters moving more towards the extremes. Where does that trend come from? Why do they not find a political home in the center anymore?
Well, we saw in 2021, actually, the young people voted mostly for the Greens and the Free Democrats. That has changed now completely since the two parties have been in government. And, there have been interviews, and just speaking to young people, they just felt disappointed in what these parties have delivered. A lot of young people felt they hadn't really understood what these parties stood for, or that their expectations were not respected. We know that both the left and the AfD are very strong in their presence on social media. This is something that the AfD has been very good at in the past few years, and that the left party has also picked up on, and some of their main candidates have been, really strong on TikTok and other platforms trying to reach this young audience, and it has really worked. And I think also in terms of, we heard that also in the press conference from the AfD, they feel like they are a party that can offer a new perspective for the future and for young people who feel like they're being ignored by politics currently. This is something that in their very different ways, both the AfD and the left party seem to offer a break from what has been happening in government until now. And, on the one hand, a more nationalist, tough on migration, economically conservative approach of the AFD. On the other hand, the left party offering an approach that the more center-left parties aren't really offering anymore, basically being open to migration and not wanting any tough measures at all, wanting more investment and getting away from the debt brake. But also, I think, for the left party in particular, the issue of Israel and Gaza and the conflict there. The left party is one party that offers an alternative to the kind of messaging we've heard coming from the other parties in government. And, this is an issue where I think young people have a sort of a different view, and that they are more critical of the actions of Israel and Gaza and how the conflict there has unfolded. And I think that's also why we've seen a lot of people, especially younger generations, sort of shift towards the left party.
Yeah, and we can't talk about social media without talking about X, about how Alice Weidel talked to Elon Musk on his own platform, how he then proceeded to endorse them very openly. So what role do you think foreign meddling played in the AFD's strong showing?
Mm-hmm. I think the Musk and also the Vance interventions on behalf of the AFD didn't really play much of a role. That really didn't convince anybody who wasn't already in the AFD camp. I think, also in the numbers, you couldn't see those numbers markedly going up after Musk and Vance at the Munich Security Conference intervened. I think the bigger issue, the much bigger issue, is foreign interference, basically on the news cycle, on the TikTok news cycle, on the social media news cycle, where lots of fake news is floating around. Where lots of Russian interference is happening on a daily basis, where fake narratives are being spun and respun again and again. And these kinds of things penetrate the minds, way beyond the classic media, which most of us still consume for the most part. Young people don't. And that's where the main disinformation operations are happening. And I can't give you a number as to how many people were, kind of moved by that. But the influence is quite strong. The investment is very little that Moscow needs to make. But the impact is quite large. These fake narratives are very hard to kind of root out after they've taken root. And so, that's where I would look. I think these prominent interventions were not particularly impactful in this case.
Yeah. Jan Techo of Eurasia Group and our very own Julia Sodelli. Thank you both for the time being. You're watching DW's special coverage of the fallout from Germany's parliamentary election. We'll be back with our studio guests in a moment, but first, another important story in the headlines at this moment. The Vatican says Pope Francis's health has deteriorated and he's now in a critical condition. Pope Francis has asked Catholics worldwide to pray for him as he battles pneumonia and a complex lung infection, which has left him in a critical condition. Blood tests showed early stages of kidney failure, but doctors said it was under control. The Vatican says the 88-year-old is alert, responsive, and attended Mass on Sunday. Our correspondent Jack Parrick is in Rome following the story for us. Jack, what's the latest we know about the Pope's health?
We had a line from the Vatican's press office this morning that said that that the night passed well and that the Pope slept and is resting. Yesterday evening, so Sunday evening, we had a message from them saying he's still receiving oxygen through his nose, that he is alert and well orientated, but the situation around his health remains critical. Obviously, as an 88-year-old man with what they had previously described as a complex state of pneumonia, which had taken through his body, through his lungs, and affecting his lungs especially, there are tenterhooks, sort of lots of people anticipating what is the situation with his health. The doctors are giving regular updates. We are getting relatively regular updates from the Vatican press office as everybody sort of braces to see whether he will recover from this. As I say, 88 years old with a very critical and complicated health situation.
Catholics around the world are, of course, praying for the Pope's recovery. What's the situation around the Vatican as people wait to find out more?
Well, it's a really big year for the Vatican. This year, 2025, is what's called a Jubilee year, which was announced back in the year 2000 by Pope John Paul II. It's a year in the Catholic Church, which is where people can sort of release their sins. They can go have remission from their sins. People are supposed to let go of debts, and in sort of historic times, slaves were meant to be freed, etc. And so the Vatican is expecting above of 30 million people to make pilgrimages. There's a path which runs up here towards the Holy Door of the Vatican, and they're expecting 30 million people throughout 2025 to make that pilgrimage from all over the world. So it's a really big year for the Vatican, and this situation with the Pope's health plays into that, but it means that there are a lot of people here who are not only making their pilgrimage, but are coming to pray for the Pope's health as well.
That was Jack Perrick in Rome. They're following the critical condition the Pope is reportedly in. Thank you so much for that update. Back to our main story now, the results of Sunday's parliamentary election here in Germany. Friedrich Merz's CDU, the Conservatives, came out on top with 28.5%. The far-right Alternative for Germany doubled their share of the vote to 20.8%, making them the second largest party. Germany's incumbent Social Democrats suffered a crushing defeat, dropping over 9 percentage points to 16.4%. The Greens fell 3 percentage points to 11.6%. The Left Party fared a lot better than expected, with 8.7% of the vote. The BSW, the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, which splintered from the Left Party last year, only took 4.97%, fell just short of the 5% threshold needed to enter Parliament. The business-friendly FDP, former coalition partner of the Greens and the Social Democrats, also fell below the 5% threshold and crashed out of Parliament. Other smaller parties together took over 4% of the vote. And we can look at how these results translate into seats for each party in Germany's parliament. The CDU will be the biggest party in the Bundestag with 208 out of the total number of 630 seats. The Social Democrats, currently still the governing party, will have 120 seats, and the Green Party 85. The far-right Alternative for Germany, the second largest party, already said that, in the parliament, will have 152 seats. Die Linke, the Left Party, will have 64. And that's all we have time for, but you're all up to date. I would say you can stay with us. I'll be back in a few minutes after a short break with Julia Saudelli and Jan Techau here in the studio with us. Thank you so much for your company. Until now.
Joyride through fascinating worlds and to uncharted depths. Our guides know their way around. is strictly scientific trip to some pretty wacky places. Curiosity is required. Tomorrow Today, in 30 minutes on DW.
Eco-Africa. What's the buzz in these Senegalese neighborhoods about? Things are bustling. The residents have come together to give their neighborhoods a facelift and have gained fame in the process. An unconventional competition with unexpected results.
Eco-Africa, in 90 minutes on DW.
We will never compromise upon equal right of and equal opportunity of education, equal right and equal opportunity of work.
In 2020, 4 Afghan women sat down with the Taliban to demand better rights for the women of Afghanistan. A unique insight into a seemingly hopeless struggle. The Sharp Edge of Peace starts March 7th on DW.
This is Shadows of German Colonialism.
These podcasts and videos shed light on a dark history, the devastating colonial horrors inflicted by Germany across Africa.
And he employed scorched earth tactics, burning farms and destroying livestock.
What is the legacy of this widespread racist oppression today?
History cannot be forgotten. We need to talk about it.
Hear the stories, Shadows of German Colonialism. Conflicts, crises, wars around the world. Everything is connected. Mapped Out shows the geopolitical reality beyond the borders. What makes things the way they are? And where are the solutions? Mapped Out, navigating a changing world. Now on YouTube.
This is DW News live from Berlin. Germany's voters have spoken and they want change. Conservative leader Friedrich Merz is set to become the country's next chancellor after a record number of Germans cast their ballots in the highest turnout since reunification. Meanwhile, the Social Democrats and current Chancellor Olaf Scholz take a hammering. They're now the Conservatives' most likely junior partner in a coalition. Scholz says he will not be involved in negotiations. And the far-right alternative for Germany, the AfD, celebrates its second-place finish. It has doubled its share of the vote since the last election. I'm Nicole Fröhlich. Welcome to the show. Germans have voted for change, with the country's conservatives claiming victory in Sunday's national election. With the votes now tallied, it has become clear that the only way to a majority for Friedrich Merz's Christian Democrats will be a coalition with the Social Democrats. The far-right AfD have come in second with a strong showing, but Merz refuses to work with them, as do all other German parties. Let's break down the numbers for you. Merz's Conservatives came out on top with 28.5%. The far-right Alternative for Germany doubled their share of the vote to 20.8%, making them the second largest party. Germany's incumbent Social Democrats suffered at the polls, dropping over 9 percentage points to 16.4%. The Greens fell 3 percentage points to 11.6%. The Left Party fared much better than expected with 8.7% of the vote. The BSW, which splintered from the Left Party last year, only took 4.97%, just short of the 5% threshold needed to enter parliament. And the business-friendly FDP, part of the former government, also fell below the 5% threshold, sending it crashing out of parliament. Other smaller parties together took around 4% of the vote. And we can look at how these results translate into seats for each party in Germany's parliament. The CDU will now be the biggest party in the Bundestag with 208 out of the total number of 630 seats. The Social Democrats, currently still the governing party, will now have only 120 seats, and the Green Party 85 seats. The far-right Alternative for Germany, now the second largest party in parliament, will have 152 seats. Die Linke, the left party, will have 64. And we can look now at how election night unfolded, starting with the Conservatives, who took first place.
We, the CDU and CSU, the Union bloc, have won this 2025 election. Friedrich Merz is the man in the driving seat. As clear winner of this election, he's set to become German Chancellor, though he still faces the tricky task of building a coalition. His centre-right CDU-CSU bloc received the most votes by a clear margin, though at under 30%, it's not the support Merz wanted. Olaf Scholz will stay on as caretaker chancellor, but his days as Germany's leader are numbered. His SPD party achieved its worst result in a national election since the 19th century. Friends, comrades, this is a bitter election result for the Social Democratic Party. It is a defeat. The Alternative for Germany party nearly doubled its support, the strongest showing for a far-right party since the Second World War. In the post-election discussion on public TV, co-leader Alice Weidel had her eyes on the levers of power.
Our hand is outstretched to take part in the government. We will support the CDU-CSU when there are motions that we approve of, if they go in the right direction. The will of the German people is clear. They want change. They want a coalition between the AfD and the Conservatives.
Weidel predicted the Conservative bloc would not be able to form a stable government, and the AfD would in time become Germany's largest party. But Merz said his party had little in common with the AfD. You can reach out to us as much as you like. We will not pursue misguided policies. The Greens saw a small drop in support, punished as all the government parties were. Among smaller parties, the left benefited from a surge in support from younger voters. It was a campaign dominated by fears. Fears about migration and Russia, a faltering economy, and the fear that Donald Trump is changing Germany's relationship with the United States. Friedrich Merz says he has a plan for all of those issues, but first he needs to find out who will join him in government.
I'm joined now by DW political correspondent Julia Saudelli and Jan Techau. He's a political analyst with the Eurasia Group. It's so good that you're still with here. They've been with me all morning, in case you've missed it. Let's dive right in. This is a man, he wants to become chancellor. He has no governing experience whatsoever. Is he the right man for the job? At the crossroads Germany finds itself right now.
This is what he has to now prove to the German people, but also to all the observers and the other countries looking at what's going to happen in Germany now. There's this urgency for Germany to form a government quickly and to, quickly make some big decisions and have to act in a geopolitical situation that is turbulent and economic times which are difficult. And, Friedrich Merz is a longtime politician. He has slowly climbed the ranks of his party, so he knows how to act in the political sphere. He is well connected, and he has been, I would say, also a good campaigner. He has resonated with voters, and now he has to show whether he can convert that status also into being a good statesman, someone who can deliver on the urgent issues that Germany has to fix. And he also has to show how ready he is to compromise and how capable he is at finding compromises with other parties, in particular the Social Democrats, the likely coalition partner, with whom they don't necessarily always agree on many things.
Yeah, he was a member of the European Parliament in the past before he joined the Bundestag. What is his European agenda? What is his European vision for Germany?
I think he has a generally positive attitude about Europe and the EU and EU integration, and he has an ambition to actually do something there and position Germany again, at the center of that Brussels debate, which unfortunately, under the Ampel coalition, the previous government almost completely fell by the wayside. There was no real visible European ambition. There was a lot of, national economic policies, and this has a tradition that goes back to Merkel, actually, very interestingly. Merz has a European ambition. He wants a real energy union, as he says. He wants a digital union so that, there's a level playing field for innovation in that field. He wants capital markets union so that, you have a more of a free flow of capital in Europe. Again, important for the economic agenda. But there are contradictions as well. He doesn't want common borrowing. He doesn't want Commerzbank to be taken over by an Italian bank. You want capital markets union, but you don't want the takeover. That doesn't square. So there are a couple of contradictions here as well. So I would say that basically at the ambition level, he's kind of got the right idea. But, how much that actually is contradicted by his own national economic agenda and also by what the coalition partner will be willing to do with him, that's the big question that we'll find out about.
Internationally, many people associate the CDU, the Christian Democrats here in Germany, with Angela Merkel, the longtime Chancellor. How is the CDU under Friedrich Merz different to the Merkel CDU?
It is a very different CDU, and especially if we consider that Angela Merkel and Friedrich Merz have been political rivals for many, many years. Basically, Merkel was the one who sort of put a stop to Friedrich Merz's climb within the CDU party. And the visions that they also have of the party are quite different, with Angela Merkel more moderate, more centrist, and Friedrich Merz moving the party more towards the right and just like also presenting the party in a different way and having, I think, also an approach to leadership that is different, with sort of Angela Merkel having this sort of attitude in which, she gave her speeches, but was also not necessarily the most entertaining, quite boring, and it was also sort of like a picture of stability and reliability that she wanted to give. Friedrich Merz, more, we can even say bombastic, but, more lively, with stronger statements in there. So it's, a different political style, but also a different political approach.
Yeah. So we have a different political style and approach on one hand, but we also have a more polarized country than ever. The extremes have been strengthened in these elections. What does that mean for Germany's standing in the world and the positions it can take and the actions it can implement?
That's exactly the problem that the new government will be facing. This is a polarized moment across society. How much political capital can you get out of a polarized society to go to the international stage, whether that's on defense or on European integration or on other things, and carry that through and have enough backing back home to get these things done? That's entirely unknown. We have not ever charted this kind of terrain. We've never brought a Germany ambitious at these levels, to a playing field where back home, your fistfights are still going on over these kinds of issues. That's the big thing. And, Friedrich Merz was a very, very skilled opposition politician, almost like a natural-born opposition politician. That was exactly the role that he could fulfill, and he was driving the last government. Now, can he translate this not just into domestic leadership, but also move to that Brussels stage that Merkel played so well? We will find out. There's a theoretic chance, of course, but personalities matter, and we'll see whether that plays.
We'll have to wait and see. Jan Techau of the Eurasia Group and Julia Saudelli of our parliamentary studio. Thank you so much, both of you, for your analysis. Well, the far-right Alternative for Germany doubled its vote share in Sunday's election and became the second largest party with 20.8%, according to preliminary results. This marks its shift from the fringes to a major political force, really. But despite its gains, all major parties have ruled out working with the AfD. It's now said to be the largest opposition party. And the party leaders told a press conference that the party's historic result was something to be proud of, and said voters wanted to see the AfD as part of a new government.
We are prepared to take on responsibility because German voters have voted for political change. We have a strong majority for the AFD and the CDU, and voters want a centrist right-wing party. Friedrich Merz seems to be sticking to his attitude of blocking working together with the AfD, which we do not think is democratic. You cannot simply exclude millions of voters. And so it is down to the Union bloc to see how they deal with this. But what we can expect is that if they do have a coalition with the SPD, they will not be able to implement all of the AfD positions that they copied.
And our political correspondent, Matthew Moore, was just at that press conference. Matthew, give us your main takeaways from this press briefing.
This was the party leadership basically flexing their muscles the morning after a historic result for them. We had an hour of questioning. The message really was that this firewall that we've heard a lot about is really undemocratic in the eyes of the AfD. They say that this is locking out millions of voters, especially in the east of the country where the AfD is the strongest party by some distance. It won 45 out of 48 seats there. We heard Weidel say that this is Alice Weidel, the Chancellor candidate of this party, say that the attacks on her and criticism about her, about where she lives in Switzerland, were basically attempts to drag the party through the mud, and that it was very Trumpian in a way. She was attacking the media. And she said, and the message really that came out loud and clear was that this was a party that was saying that we will overtake the Christian Democrats, the centre-right, the party that won last night's elections. Long term, they really feel like they have the momentum at their back. And I would say, finally, the one thing that someone said was, have you heard from Elon Musk? Now, Elon Musk's backed the AfD very vocally in recent weeks and months, and she said, yeah, he personally congratulated her.
Mm-hmm. You talked about 2029, the next elections, where the AfD hopes to become the strongest party. For now, it's in second place, has no option for power or government participation. Where does that leave the party and its voters?
It leaves them allowing to talk about the fact that they would say that they're being cut out of the democratic process. As long as they are not part of the government, they can say that they can offer a real alternative to what the current government in Germany is delivering and doing on a number of the key issues that the AfD is talking about with voters. But essentially, it's also about the fact that they're counting on a coalition government basically not being able to kind of chart a clear path. Now, Alice Weidel has said several times since last night that the message from this vote is that the German voters want a centre-right, as she said, a centre-right coalition government, and they will not get that if the Christian Democrats go into government with a centre-left party, which looks like the only option they have. So her message really is to the voters, you are continuing to be ignored when the government goes out of its way not to work with the Alternative for Germany.
How do the remaining parties feel about that? Because for now, Germany's firewall, as it's called, the cordon sanitaire, excluding the AfD from governing, remains in place. Is Friedrich Merz likely to stick to this red line? Because we've seen him kind of flexible on what it means for him in the past. So since last night and in recent weeks and months, he's been at pains to say that he would not go into coalition with the Alternative for Germany party because he thinks they're too extreme. However, we saw that vote in the Bundestag last month, or certainly at the start of this month, at the end of last month, where they did indeed vote with the AfD on a non-binding motion on migration. And that, for a lot of people, then raised questions about whether the Christian Democrat Party, if they got into power, whether they would be willing to accept the votes of the AfD when it came to a crunch in the Bundestag. And it could well come to that in the future, because the majority that any government would have
in the future would be very, very small. And it could be that they do rely on the AfD votes. And what we've heard from, or what we see from Christian Democrats is that they're not necessarily willing to reject those votes if it came to it. And that's quite significant for the AfD, because they know that they can play a role, even if they're not in government, that they can certainly potentially play a role in the next legislative period.
That was DW's Matthew Moore. Thank you so much. Well, the world has already reacted to the vote. Among many leaders congratulating Friedrich Merz, U.S. President Donald Trump celebrated the election result in a social media post, saying the conservative victory was a great day for Germany and the United States alike. Trump's confidant, tech billionaire Elon Musk, endorsed the far-right Alternative for Germany party ahead of the vote. We heard it there. He apparently also already congratulated them on their result. Last month, Musk gave a virtual address at an AfD rally, saying only the AfD can save Germany. That is something he also posted on his social media network X. Friedrich Merz has been critical of Musk's support for the AfD, saying it resembles election interference by Russia.
The interventions from Washington were no less dramatic and impertinent than the interventions we have seen from Moscow. We are under massive pressure from two sides.
The makeup of Germany's next government has implications for its European partners, of course. Speaking in Brussels, EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas said a smooth and quick transition of power in Germany was crucial.
The German people have made their choice, and now they need to put together the government, and I hope that they do it as fast as possible, because we really need to move on with the decisions also on the European level that requires German participation.
That was Kaja Kallas there, and our correspondent Rosie Bircher joins us from the EU foreign ministers meeting in Brussels. Rosie, great to see you. How have other European leaders been reacting to the election results here in Germany?
Congratulations have been pouring in from across the European Union. We know Friedrich Merz has already had Emmanuel Macron, the French president, on the phone, and also ministers who've been filing into these talks have been sharing their congratulations for Friedrich Merz. But a couple of key messages from them. One, that a strong Germany is seen as absolutely essential for a strong European Union. Germany is the economic powerhouse of this bloc. It's also the most populous country. It's a diplomatic heavyweight. And then, of course, that call for a quick coalition formation. Over the past few years, we've seen the current coalition in Germany, politics, bust-ups, disagreements within that coalition bleeding into European Union politics. And I've definitely had diplomats on the phone over the last few years expressing frustration, saying they simply didn't know what Germany's line was. They want more clarity from Berlin moving forward. I just maybe would highlight one exception to that. Congratulations in general from leaders. That's the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Instead of congratulating Friedrich Merz publicly, he's been congratulating Alice Weidel, the leader of the Alternative for Germany party, who is seen really as one of his political allies on farther to the right of the European political spectrum.
Yeah, not a big surprise there. The elections come at a very uncertain time for the European Union, and with far-right parties recently making strong gains across the bloc, not just here in Germany. What does that mean for the EU?
What we're seeing is a continuation of a trend of Europe's political centre of gravity shifting toward the right. What that has meant in practice over the past year or so is a push for a more restrictive migration policy at European Union level. It could be, depending on the policies that Germany chooses to pursue, depending on the coalition that Friedrich Merz can negotiate, that his policies end up kind of locking horns with European Union laws. We'll see how that turns out. And secondly, it tends to also mean a push for a more of a deregulation agenda, trying to cut red tape. That's something which is being criticised by climate campaigners, for example, who fear for the future of the EU's big green promises. On the other hand, we have those who say, look, there simply is too much red tape and bureaucracy in the European Union if it wants to try and stand up and compete with the likes of China and the United States. Also, just worth mentioning that how it works here in the European Union's table is that each leader gets a seat, and with the likely departure of Olaf Scholz, we'll see one less centre-left leader here at the European Union's table. That's a trend we've also seen across the bloc. We saw Finland and Portugal also switched from centre-left to a centre-right leader. So I think we'll likely have some soul-searching in that social democratic centre-left camp, not only in Germany, but also really across the European Union.
Yeah, and today, just briefly, also marks 3 years of the full-scale invasion Russia launched against Ukraine. What will ministers be talking about there today?
They've already greenlit a fresh round of sanctions against Moscow, trying to continue that bid to cripple the Kremlin's ability to keep financing its war in Ukraine. But that's really just seen as a continuation of a policy rather than any sort of a radical rethink. And that is what is on European Union leaders' minds. With the shockwave sent by the Trump administration across the European Union in terms of Donald Trump's overtures toward Vladimir Putin, there's a feeling that there needs to be a radical ramp-up of defence spending and a radical increase in terms of support to Ukraine, where European leaders, many of them, are in Kiev today to try and send that message. There's been a sense, as leaders have huddled together to try and put their heads together over the last couple of days, that Olaf Scholz, who's representing Germany, may simply have been the wrong man to be in these talks, given his likely departure from office in the next few months. The question is, what will Friedrich Merz bring to the table? He's signalled that he wants to continue Germany's strong and staunch backing for Ukraine, but there will be a couple of key questions still to be answered by this bloc, not least whether Germany is open to taking on joint debt in a bid to finance that splurge on defence that so many say is sorely needed.
Rosie Burchard in Brussels, thanks for that. Well, a dozen leaders from Europe and Canada have traveled to Ukraine's capital to mark that third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion. The group includes European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, along with European Council President Antonio Costa. They will be discussing European support for Kyiv with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. This comes as Washington has suggested Ukrainian concessions to win a peace deal from Moscow. Leaders from Spain, Baltic nations, and Scandinavian countries were also visiting Kyiv to mark the anniversary. Ukraine's President Zelensky gave a press conference in Kyiv last night, saying he'd give up his presidency in exchange for peace under the NATO security umbrella. Let's take a look at what happened there.
The Ukrainian president took to the stage to answer journalists' questions on the eve of the third anniversary of Russia's invasion. Amid fierce criticism from the Trump administration, Volodymyr Zelensky stayed firm in his push to get security guarantees from Washington and eventually join NATO. When asked if he would resign in exchange for peace, Zelensky said he's prepared to step down if needed.
If to achieve peace you really need me to give up my post, I'm ready. I can trade it for NATO, if there are such conditions. But at this moment, I don't want to talk about it for a long time. I am focused on Ukraine's security today, not in 20 years. I am not going to be in power for decades.
U.S. President Donald Trump has demanded that Ukraine give the U.S. $500 billion in valuable raw materials as a payback for American aid. Zelensky has rejected the demands.
I negotiated with Biden and negotiated with the Congress of the United States of America. I am grateful to the Congress. There was bipartisan support for the grants. A grant is not a debt, and we do not have a debt to repay.
The Ukrainian president added he would not agree to a deal that would have to be paid off by 10 generations of future Ukrainians. Zelensky's comments followed a heated exchange with Donald Trump, who last week called him a, quote, dictator without elections. The Ukrainian leader said he was not offended by Trump's remarks.
I would not describe the words President Trump addressed to me as a compliment, to put it mildly. Yes, but why be offended? One might be offended by the word dictator if he was a dictator. But I take it like this. What can you do? We will live with the U.S. somehow.
Zelensky also called on Trump to meet with him before any summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
And before we go, a quick look at another developing story. Pope Francis has asked Catholics worldwide to pray for him as he battles pneumonia and a complex lung infection, which has reportedly left him in a critical condition. Blood tests showed he also suffered from early stages of kidney failure, but doctors said it was under control. The Vatican says the 88-year-old is alert, responsive, and attended Mass on Sunday. And a reminder of today's top story. Voters here in Germany have opted for change. Conservative bloc leader Friedrich Merz is poised to become the country's next chancellor, with his CDU-CSU alliance taking just under 30% of the vote. Merz rules out forging a coalition with the far right, who came in second. You're watching DW News from Berlin. My colleague Claire Richardson will have more headlines for you at the top of the next hour. Join her if you can. Bye-bye. Thanks for your company.
Joyride through fascinating worlds and to uncharted depths. Our guides know their way around. A strictly scientific trip to some pretty wacky places. Curiosity is required. Tomorrow Today. Next on DW.
Eco-Africa. What's the buzz in these Senegalese neighborhoods about? Things are bustling. The residents have come together to give their neighborhoods a facelift and have gained fame in the process. An unconventional competition with unexpected results.
Eco-Africa. In 60 minutes on DW. DW Travel.
Hello there.
Let's go. The sights, the history, the food.
Very good.
Garnished with insider tips and local highlights.
Wow. Welcome. Let's go.
Shall we go that way? Let's go that way.
But also when it comes to sustainability, information and trends, on DW Travel, you can have it all.
This is unexpected. Okay, I have to check this out.
So, you're planning a trip? Make sure you miss nothing about it on DW Travel.
I hope you enjoyed the trip here as much as I did.
What about you? What's your opinion? Feel free to write your thoughts in the comments.
Humanity's closest relatives died out 40,000 years ago. Traces of Neanderthals have been found from Europe to Siberia. And at some point, before going extinct, they interbred with our ancestors from Africa. Studies of ancient Homo sapien genomes have now pinpointed exactly when at least one of those encounters took place. That story and more on DW's Science Show. Welcome to Tomorrow Today.
Archaeological treasures can be found in the Ilsenhöhle, a cave in the German state of Thuringia. Bone fragments from humans who lived 45,000 years ago. Such remains are very rare. Researcher Arev Sumer and her team examined the bones at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. DNA analyzed from samples they drilled from the bones revealed the oldest Homo sapiens genome ever discovered. The remains were left by our direct ancestors.
In most cases, if you're working with such old material, is really degraded, low quality, very contaminated DNA fragments. And this is really a challenge to work with because we cannot really get a lot of information out of it.
By contrast, the quality of the bones from the German cave and from another site in the Czech Republic was exceptional. An analysis of the DNA showed that the modern humans that left it had, in evolutionary terms, only recently arrived in Europe from Africa. The bones found came from several different individuals. They were probably among the first modern Europeans. Along the way, however, they encountered another type of human, Neanderthals. Studies have shown the two groups interacted and had offspring. What we didn't know was when that took place exactly, but now we've been able to use these genomes from Thuringia and the Czech Republic to date when these breeding interactions occurred, because we found long sections of Neanderthal DNA in these genomes. It tells us the breeding probably occurred